We tried our best to make my father think he was crazy, but it never worked. My father was honest. My mother and I were not, but he found our games delightful, and so he tolerated them. He'd hide cans of nut mixes in his room strategically, the good kind, coated crispy with salt and sugar. We'd wait until he was gone, sneak into his room, and consume the little cans of nuts like barbarian chipmunks, squealing with delight. My father would return home to his little kingdom sacked. He'd play indignant. We'd smile. Another battle won. My part in the games began when I was 3 years old. I loved flowers, and I always wanted a garden, but my mother said we couldn't because our soil wasn't rich. One day, my father cut down a yellow rose bush in our backyard. It was in the way. I thought it was cruel to destroy the only beautiful thing we had, and so it began. My father passed away when I was 19 years old. At the moment he died, he became magic to me. But before that, when I was a girl, he was a pain in my ass. My father built the house that I grew up in. Our home was shaded by 30-year-old pecan trees that he had planted himself, grand, full-grown things 25 feet high. My father loved those pecan trees, but even more than that, he loved the pecans they produced. To me, the word pecan echoes with the sound of its dry shell skin cracking. I remember the feeling of them popping under my bare feet, or the sound of their dry husks being crushed by my father's Brookstone nutcracker, by far the fanciest thing he owned. Often, he'd crack the shells directly in his hand, standing in the shade of the very trees themselves. He'd offer me a piece, and there'd inevitably be a shard of shell in it, woody and astringent. My father loved eating the nuts that he had grown, but the nuts needed protection. Squirrels love pecans, and therefore my father hated the squirrels. He tried everything to rid our yard of the encroachers, spraying jalapeno pepper potion on the trees, running out onto the lawn, howling. One year he even pulled the pecans down before they were even ripe, thinking that he'd get to them before they could be stolen. He had a BB gun on our kitchen windowsill to scare the little bastards off. My dad never shot a squirrel. He made a lot of noise, but he had a gentle spirit. My father was a New Yorker and a former opera singer, and he had a flair for the dramatic. Whenever a squirrel was spotted, he would play The Ride of the Valkyries on the stereo and run outside, shooting a few ounces of steel into the sky and hollering triumphantly. When I was 9, my father attempted his coup de grace against the squirrels, hanging yards and yards of garden hose in his pecan trees. The theory was that the squirrels would think the hoses were snakes and, smelling danger, would stay away. There was an early frost that year, and I spent a happy hour pulling the hoses out of the trees, standing on one end with my left foot and kicking the other with my right foot, crushing them into little pieces. What remained of the hoses after my romp hung in the trees limp, never to fulfill their destinies. We'd never know if those hoses would have worked. My father was the Wile E. Coyote of Hanover Lane. He never tried the same trick twice. There'd be no fun in that. The weird thing was that my father had 5 pecan trees. He couldn't eat all of those pecans even if he had wanted to. I think that in the end it was all just a game. My father gave the distinct impression that he'd seen it all before, and he didn't mind life's little indignities no matter who was doing the doling. Squirrels, his own wife and child, all the many faces of a great divine laugh. 13 years after his death, those paper bags of pecans were in our garage, still unripe. I was there to say goodbye to our home. My mother was selling the place and moving to another state. I walked into the backyard to plant a yellow rose bush, partly to spite the old man one last time, but also to offer a truce, to honor him and the place that he loved so much. I wandered over to the hose to water the roses, and I found a patch of wild strawberries, probably the result of a blistering Texas summer I had spent eating berries in the backyard years ago. I looked at one of my father's pecan trees, and there, 8 feet up, was a 6-inch piece of garden hose. The tree had grown up around it, making it part of its body. I touched the tree and laughed. I had always wanted a garden, but my mother said we couldn't because our soil wasn't rich. The trees would argue otherwise.